welcome to the online certificate course on Indian Foreign Policy under Foreign Policy School, a FPRC initiative. I am Riya Sharma, pursuing MA in Political Science from MS College for Women, Maharaja Ganga Singh University, Bikaner, Rajasthan, and an intern of the FPRC Online Foreign Policy School, New Delhi. We are honored to have with us today Shri Santosh Sharma Poudel. He is a foreign policy analyst and co-founder of Nepal Institute for Foreign Research and leads the National Security and Foreign Affairs Cluster. He is also a faculty at Department of International Relations and Diplomacy, Tribhuvan University. He writes on Nepali foreign and security policy and regional order regularly in Nepali newspapers and magazines. Besides Nepal, his areas of interest are South Asian regional order, China's rise, and security in the Asia-Pacific. He advises and conducts research for Institute of Foreign Affairs, a semi-autonomous research institute of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Nepal. He received his bachelor's from Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University, Japan, and master's from S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University. He was awarded the ST Engineering Gold Medal for his excellence at RSIS and Nepal Vidyabhushan from the Government of Nepal. We are honored to have you with us today, sir. We look forward to learning from your experience. Now, I would like to hand over the proceedings to Professor Mohendra Gaur, Director, FPRC, New Delhi.
Thank you, Riya, for your wonderful welcome notes. And now I would like to request Sri Sharma Sahab to bring his lecture. And before that, I would like to thank him once again for having accepted our invite. And we hope our students will benefit by his views on the bilateral ties between Nepal and India. So now it's all over to you, Sharma Sahab.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I think first of all, I'd like to thank Professor Gaur for inviting me to Foreign Policy Research Center, the online course, and talk about Nepal foreign policies, challenges, and way forward. Just before this, I was just going through the previous speakers who have appeared here, and I'm very humbled to be invited in this forum because some of the names that I saw there are the people I read, I admire, and I aspire to be. A couple of them, like Professor Sato Yoichiro, he was my undergraduate thesis supervisor. And then I saw Kumar Ramakrishnan there, who used to be with RSIS. So I'm very happy to be a part in this particular journey. Now, today I'll speak more on an individual capacity. Some of the points that I will make today are more mainstream, while some others, it may not be as such, like there may not be many people who agree with my point of view. So let's take that, let's take today's lecture as me delivering on my individual capacity, and let's engage with each other on that particular spirit. Now, to analyze Nepal's foreign policy, again, a pretty large, broad topic, but then I think I'll just try to narrow it down in a way by dividing that into three images, the world's three images, which is basically man, state, and the war, international system, the national system, and then the individual, but in a slightly modified way to talk about international system, and then to talk about the regional system, because that is very relevant to Nepali foreign policy, especially the neighborhood. And then at the national system, I'll talk very briefly about the man part of it. But in Q&A, if anybody of you is interested, we can get in there as well. Now with that, let's start with the international system first. Now, for each system, I'll just take one or two examples of what Nepal's interests are, how Nepal pursues some of those issues, and then see what the challenges are in that particular context. So to start with, in international system, let's start with Nepal's one of the major interests in maintaining international rule-based order. Now, what it means is that the behavior of states, at least to Nepal's understanding, should be constrained by some internationally agreed rules and norms of behavior. Now, this is in contrast to what realists often refer to as an anarchic world and a very Machiavellian approach, whereby the end justifies the means. Such rules-based order ensures that all states can participate in global affairs equally. And in order to establish such rules or norms, institutions play a greater role. Now, this policy itself, therefore, born out of liberal institutionalism to a large degree. Now, Nepal's understanding of the rule-based international order is slightly different from the understanding of especially the Western countries, such as the US and the EU, who often use it to mean the maintenance of the status quo of the global system that had developed in their image. Right. For Nepal, what rule-based international order means is that states should be treated equally, or have the principle of sovereign equality. There should be non-interference in domestic affairs, no use of force, at least peaceful resolution of dispute as far as possible, global collaboration in addressing global challenges, and so forth. Now, a lot of this principle for Nepal comes from the UN Charter. The Constitution of Nepal itself puts the UN Charter at the center of Nepal's foreign policy. The principles of Panchashil, I think that has been a trademark for foreign relations of India, of Nepal as well, and so forth. Now, such rule-based order is of particular importance for smaller states to overcome the issues of asymmetry in power and interest. Additionally, it is growing in importance because of the interconnected nature of the world. Doing so both set the limit on activities and provides common guidelines for all states, big or small, to follow. Now, let's take an example of that in action with respect to Nepal's foreign policy. And let's take a global case, the war in Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine earlier this year. On surface, this should be of rather less concern for Nepal because we have our diplomatic relations with Nepal, but that's more or less about it. There has not been a single leader's visit, or we don't have embassies or consulates in each other state, and there is very little interaction. Some trade there, but very little interaction between the two countries. Now, there have been some indirect implications. For example, the price of fuel and food prices has gone up, and it affects Nepal as well. But those has been rather indirect impacts of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, despite that, Nepal has voted against Russia twice and criticized Russia's invasion twice at the UN, and has criticized Russia's invasion. Why was this important to Nepal? Now, there are critical principles at stake here for Nepal. Firstly, Russia's use of force against another, it was the case of Russia's use of force against its neighbor, a rather weaker neighbor compared to the Russia's size and might. The principle of sovereignty, the bedrock of modern international system, was violated. If Nepal were to accept this as the way of global order, it threatens its own sovereignty and security. Now, additionally, Nepal was also particularly concerned, actually in this particular case, by the Indian and Chinese response to the invasion. China actually has been actively supporting the Russian invasion. In case of India, that has been more tacit. If there is any support, if no support, then at least India seems to have turned a blind eye. We understand that both these countries have strategic reasons for their position, justifiable strategic concerns vis-a-vis Russia, but that to Nepal, talking from Nepal's perspective, that sets a very dangerous precedent. What were to happen to Nepal if India or China decided to invade Nepal? If they had strategic reasoning to do so, what would be the situation? What would happen to Nepal's defense sovereignty, the country as a whole? That is a larger concern and a big reason why Nepal is in favor of certain principles, not just for the security of Nepal, but for the security of many small states. Hence, Nepal stresses on the US-centered international order, focusing on global rules to ensure its own survival, to ensure the survival of other small states, as well. After all, laws in general is to protect the less powerful from the more powerful ones. And international law in this particular case is no different in the purpose. Now, with a global trend towards nationalism and certain level of backlash against globalization, is being seen in the rise of Trump, Brexit, global criticism against WHO for the way it handled the pandemic, for even FCC for failing to address the climate change and so forth, are serious causes of concern. They point from a Nepalese perspective for a need for Nepal to engage more countries, like-minded countries which share common interests, to promote each other's through by developing international rules and by going through international institutions. Now, moving on to the next, at regional level, I'd like to bring up the geostrategic dilemma that Nepal is facing by the increasing Chinese and to a lesser extent, the American interest in Nepal. Now, managing Nepal's relations with India and China has always been at the center of Nepal's foreign policy and will continue to be the most critical part of Nepal's foreign policy. Now, Nepal's relations with India is old and unique in every sense of the word. Now, we often tend to use unique in very light ways, but I think in this particular context, unique actually is the appropriate term here. Geographically speaking, culturally, linguistically, in terms of people-to-people connections that we have there, the 1950 treaty, which provides the nationals of these two countries almost equal treatment in each other's, this is a manifestation of the critical relations that these two countries share. Now, our relations is deep, wide, with India. Every major political development in Nepal has some level of Indian footprint in it. Now, it is our closest neighbor, the first responder during times of crisis, as we saw during the 2015 earthquake as well, in a country that Nepal looks up to follow, even on its own. Now, on the other hand, India's relations with China similarly goes a long time back in history and has transcended the mountains. It has been an trusted, though less engaged partner in the past. Now, in the last decade or so, Chinese engagement has increased tremendously, not only in Nepal, but in the region and globally. There has been a great concern, especially in New Delhi, that increasing Chinese engagement in Nepal would dilute India's influence and presence in Nepal and undermine its own security. On the other hand, increasing American presence in Nepal is of major concern for China. Increasing American presence is also of a concern for Nepal because, for simple reasons, that India has long considered Nepal to be its backyard and wants to maintain its pole position in Nepal. Now, let's take two examples at regional level to see how this dynamics is at play. Now, first, let's talk about the MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation Compact. It is a $500 million grant between the US and Nepal. Now, it was first signed in 2017 after a couple of years of negotiation, and a condition, and which was unique in this particular case again, a condition for that agreement to come into implementation was that the agreement had to be ratified by the parliament in Nepal. Now, when it came to the fore, when it came to the discussion, it led to very toxic debate, often based on misinformation and having a strong nationalist undertone in Nepal. China was visibly displeased and called American efforts to pressure a form of coercion. It is not very clear how MCC, which would focus on infrastructural projects on transport and energy, would threaten the Chinese interest in Nepal, but then they tried their best to prevent the ratification of MCC. Now, that is a geopolitical challenge at global and at regional level that Nepal will have to face as China and American competition grows stronger, and it will only grow stronger in coming years. Now, second, let's take the very recent case that we're still ongoing issue of Agniveer. I think Nepal's Gurkha joined the Indian military, a legacy of the British rule in India. Right. And after the British left, there was a tripartite agreement between the UK, Nepal, and India about recruiting Nepalese Gurkhas in British and Indian army. Now, for India, it's changed its policy on the modality of recruiting the army, with Agniveer basically recruiting them on a short-term basis and then letting go of 3/4 of the new recruits and only retaining 1/4 of the new recruits. Now, for most of the countries in the world, this would have been a purely domestic issue, but such is the relations between India and Nepal that this is of great concern to Nepal as well. In this particular context, Nepal was neither consulted, right, and informed only after the decision was made. Now, in this particular case, it seems like India took Nepal for granted. Now, given our geographical position, the historical ties with both India and China, the way in terms of the way how to deal with India and China, many in Nepal have argued that Nepal needs to have a balanced relations between the two neighbors, China in the north, India in the south. This has been the narrative set by King P.N. Saha, the founder of modern Nepal, who called Nepal a yam between two boulders. This characterization has stuck and is deep-rooted among foreign policy elites and decision makers. Personally, and I think this is where I will be in a very big minority in Nepal, I find this characterization in the modern era faulty, and I think this characterization should expire. Now, Nepal is geographically facing India. There is no two ways about it. Even though we share border with China and India, the kind of border we share with these two countries are very different. On one side, we have the tough Himalayas. On the other side, it's a natural prolongation of the subcontinent. Right? We have deep cultural, religious, people-to-people relations. Like I said before, the 1950 treaty, and millions of Indians working in Nepal, millions of Nepalese working in India. Our trade, more than 2/3 of our trade is with India. Now, if we also include trade with third countries via India, that would be really high up. Now, in this context, equating Nepal's relations with any other country, even China in this particular case, I don't think it is supported by the reality of what is happening on the ground. Therefore, going forward, I believe that Nepal should recognize this reality and create its foreign policy accordingly. In saying that, this is not to downplay Nepal's relations with China, or for that matter with the US. They are critical partners. There is no second thought about it. And even between them two, probably China more so than the US. Now, one of the examples I cite, just to give a perspective of the relative importance of India and China to Nepal, is just imagine for a moment that there is a major political or natural disaster in Nepal, and some people have to flee their homeland. Where do you think they would flee first, and in large numbers? Now, probably they would flee to other parts of Nepal if that is available, but if not, if they have to flee to any other country, there will be a lot more refugees in India going to India compared to any other countries. Now, this again shows the kind of close relations we have with India and the need for a very realistic perspective that we need to have on Nepal's partnership on the north and in the south. Now, sadly, I do not see this the change in the narrative happening soon, or the change in policy. The last foreign policy we had in 2019, in the second paragraph itself, it states that Nepal will have independent and balanced relations. And I think this narrative is so deep-rooted that I think it will be there for a while. Finally, let's get to the national issue. Now, foreign policy is often known to be the extension of domestic policy, and I think there is just more than a kernel of truth in this particular statement. Now, Nepal has seen multiple systemic and political changes in the last few decades. Since 1990, we almost had one government on average a year. And no government has been very keen to ensure continuity in major foreign policy issues for a long time, especially since 1990s. Foreign policy was not even prioritized because we were stuck in battling internal instability and for more than a decade fighting insurgency at home. Now, in the last 3 decades, while countries like India and Bangladesh have risen in global significance, Nepal's global presence has regressed. So even in terms of promises, we have made many promises and broken that, some countries actually have started to question Nepal's commitment to certain issues of our foreign policy. Now, let's take an example. Again, we briefly talked about MCC before. Let's talk that from how it played domestically, right? Now, the discussions, like I said before, for the agreement started in 2015 and continued till we signed the agreement in 2017, and the ratification started in the discussions for ratification started in early 2020, early in 2021, finally done in 2022. Now, during this period, all 3 major different political parties, the Nepali Congress, which is currently in government, the Maoist party led by Prachanda, which is a coalition partner in the current government, and the CP and UEML, the largest opposition party now, they all have been in power at different times, and they have all moved forward with the agreement. They have all supported the agreement when they were in power. But when in 2021, the issue was raised for ratification under the KP Oli government, the party in opposition now, the Maoists themselves, who were a coalition with the Oli government at that particular time, opposed the ratification because Prachanda had personal grudges against Oli. Now, he used this particular topic, a critical foreign policy issue, to bring about the downfall of the KP Oli government, now for personal gain. Now, after that, the current government led by Deuba came to power. While Prachanda privately supported the ratification, he publicly opposed the agreement. At the same time, Oli, who supported the agreement when he was the prime minister, would only conditionally support when the government changed. And his condition was that the Prachanda had to be thrown out of the coalition government if the current government needed Oli's support in order to ratify the government. Now, Prachanda finally came around to support the agreement because he was not willing to bow out of the government and provide Oli the upper hand. Now, in essence, the largest grant that Nepal had ever received, it just became a political football, ratified in the end, but then I think for all wrong reasons. In saying that, Nepal leaders generally have been more consistent in terms of some of the principles, such as not allowing Nepalese territory to be used against the vital interest of neighbors, particularly China and India. The application of that principle has been partly passive for a couple of reasons. One, because Nepal does not have a clear idea of or clear common consensus on what the legitimate interests of these 2 countries are, and hence what constitutes a threat to the interest of these countries. And partly because governments have changed so quickly that, policies have also tended to follow that. However, despite that, there has not been a major disruption in terms of major foreign policy. We have not made much progress, but there has not been a big disruptions either, probably because there is so much factional infighting, political infighting within the parties, that no single party or single leader is so dominant that they can change the policy to their whims. So on a larger context, Nepalese foreign policy has more or less settled towards the mean because of the weakness and in some sense that has been good for the foreign policy of Nepal. Now, with those examples today, I think I summarized about 3 images, basically the international image, the regional, or basically, and the state system, and very briefly talked about some of the key leaders. Now, going forward, there are a few steps, some of them easier to follow, some of them more difficult for Nepalese foreign policy challenges. Now, first of all, I think, and very easy to suggest and probably much more difficult to do is Nepal needs to keep the house in order. The kind of problems that we saw on foreign policy issues, like with the MCC, or in some cases in our relations with China, could have been easily solved if our own house was in order. Because there is so much factions, it keeps the door open for foreign influence peddling. Second, at least Nepal need to develop a national minimum consensus when it comes to critical issues of foreign policy, so that no matter which government is in power, there is some continuity and some strength of unity. And third, I think to a certain extent, we feel that, especially in context of India, in Nepal, we often tend to take India for granted. Now, I think that's the engagement has been so vast, and probably we wrongly feel that we understand each other so much. There has been less effort in order to improve relations with India, and we have taken India for granted, and vice versa. For the long term, that is not good for Nepal's foreign policy. Also for Indian foreign policy vis-a-vis Nepal. Next point, I think some of the issues that has come up in the last couple of years has been because there has been less transparency in Nepal when dealing with particular issues. For example, the MCC signed in 2017, there should have been a debate when it was being signed on why it was needed, what the potential implications would be. Now, that was kept under wraps for a long time, only came up for national discussion in 2020, 2021. Similar case happened with the state partnership program, an agreement between Nepali army and then with the US State Guard. Now that was shrouded, again, that was signed in 2019, but then that only came in the news in 2022, and then there was a very bad debate, and Nepal finally had to rescind, partly due to pressure from Beijing, but partly because it was shrouded in secrecy. Ministry of Foreign Affairs was totally left out of the agreement and so forth, which gave ample reasons for other powers to have a doubt on why that particular agreement was being done. Right. Next step, I think Nepal on its own has to take initiative to understand what the legitimate interests of its neighbors are and address them accordingly. I think in order to do so, there has to be a national debate, not just in Nepal, but also in India, regarding what India expects from Nepal, what the Indian red lines are, what the Nepalese red lines are, and then talk forward. I think the EPG report in this particular context was a good case in point. It has been stuck in a limbo, but I think that was the right way forward. Another point, I think, especially talking from a Nepalese perspective, I think, and this comes a lot when we deal with India, and recently this has crept up when we deal with China as well, is the concept of sovereign equality. I think there is a tendency on some leaders in India to view themselves as the elder brother, but then I think there is a yearning in Nepal to be treated more as an equal. Now, I think, to me, India as a larger country can take the lead. And I think Gujarat Doctrine that we had in 1990s and the concept of non-reciprocity was a step in the right direction. Right. And another important point, I think also the next point going forward is, I think we need to stop seeing every issue between India and Nepal and China from a geopolitical lens. Now, definitely, geopolitics is a critical component of Nepal-China relations, of Nepal-India relations, of Nepal's engagement with the US and so forth. But that is just one part of our engagement, especially with India. We have a host of other issues which are not directly related to geopolitics. Therefore, I think we have to make a conscious effort to decouple every issue. For example, the issue of Agniveer does not necessarily have to be a geopolitical lens. It has been an area of engagement between India and Nepal, has its own merits and has its own issues, but then it does not necessarily have to have an impact on geopolitics. Similarly, Chinese engagement in Nepal does not necessarily come with the cost for Nepal's relations with India. For example, Chinese investment in certain infrastructure will only help further Nepal-India relations. It does not necessarily have to come at the cost of Indian influence in Nepal. In this context, I think there is a need to compartmentalize different issues that Nepal-India faces, that Nepal-China faces, that Nepal deals with other countries, and deal each of those issues on their own merit. Now, some of these issues, like I said before, is much easier for me to say and not very easy to implement. But then I think with this way forward, let me just stop here. And if you have any questions and comments, I'll be really happy to engage you on personal level. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharmaji, for wonderful and precise coverage of all the issues, the challenges facing India-Nepal relations, and what are the Nepal's options, and how well Nepal is trying to safeguard its national interest. And now I would like to open the house for a question-answer session. Now I will ask the students to introduce themselves first and put their questions in a simple and clear manner. So be quick about the questions.
Hello, sir.
Yes, go on.
Hello, sir. Hello, sir. I'm Gayatri Dandekar. I have graduated from Ferguson College in History, Politics, and Sociology. I'm an aspiring diplomat. I wanted to ask you about the issue of Kalapani and Lipu Lake. What are your views on that?
Okay, Professor Gaur, do we take a couple of questions at a time, or shall I answer this question first?
You can, answer them individually. I think students will be more satisfied when they are responded to individually.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Gayatri. I think this has been, I think the territorial dispute between India and Nepal has been a critical part of Nepal-India relations, I think in 2019, 2020. Since then, I think that was when Nepal amended its constitution to include, I think, Lipu Lake, Limpiadura, and Kalapani as Nepal's territory in the official map. And I think post that, there was a very, Nepal-India relations went into a very low ebb during that phase. Now, technically speaking, I would not want to go into the irredentist claims of, who is what. I think there has been a ton of evidence on either sides, I think, to say why and how the land disputed territory belongs to. My only hope in this particular context, now leaving aside the claims, is that, again, like I said before, the countries share a long border, more than 600 kilometers of border. I think that is one area in the west, which is the region that you mentioned, where we have a dispute. There is a small region in the middle plains, in Susta, where we have another dispute. But then my larger point is, I think we should let the have a major political debate on this. I think this is not an issue that can be solved by intellectuals alone or by the bureaucrats. In this context, high-level political engagement is necessary. But I firmly believe that Nepal and India should not allow this one particular issue to affect a host of other issues that we have. Therefore, as this issue, it has to be, we have to continue engaging on this issue on the back, but still, there are a lot of other more urgent issues that in addressing as well. And I think this one issue alone should not be let to dictate the Nepal-India relations alone. I'm not sure if that is a very satisfactory answer, but yeah.
No, sir, it's fine. Also, I have one more question.
Sure.
For example, you talked about a lot of psychological terms that we use in therapy in terms of international relations. And actually, I have also a complementary interest in both psychology and international relations. So you talked about taking the other side for granted and mutual respect and yeah. So for example, you also mentioned an example of Ukraine and how it relates to Nepal. So I have always wondered, whenever, like, I'm someone who even sees and someone who believes in national interest, but at the same time, I'm someone who does not like any weaker side, be it in terms of people or even countries, to get bullied by anyone. This is how I am as a person. And I have whenever I see any small power getting bullied by a big power, it genuinely affects me. So this is what I have always thought. For example, in therapy, we see that there are support groups of people who go through some challenging times, or with people who are like-minded and who share some kind of common interest. So do you think in terms of international relations, such kind of support group might help, or how will it help, and how far will it go in terms of the ruthless world of international relations?
Well, okay, thank you. I think before I answer your question, I think this is one recommendation that I'd like to give all students who study international relations. I think just go beyond the subject, as in, I think, like you said, psychology, sociology, economics, geography, history. You know, you will not regret reading books or reading theories, reading ideas on this particular topic. This will only add to your understanding of international relations. Right? Therefore, read widely, and it won't hurt when you are talking about international relations. Now, leaving that aside, I think concerning power, I think there is an ideal world that we want to live in. I think, and the kind of principles that we have, the sovereign equality, is one manifestation of that idealism, the kind of world we want. But then again, just to give you an example, the Indian ambassador to Nepal and Nepalese ambassador to India, they basically, in terms of reputation, they hold the same prestige or the same respect. But in terms of influence, I doubt if that's the same. Right? In that sense, even when there are certain principles, there are certain practicalities that comes when you are larger power, that comes when you have a bigger muscle. The question is how the larger power wants to use its muscle, right? So, just like it would be wrong to say everybody in the world will be equal today, one day. I don't think that will happen. Similarly, states are all at different stages, have different powers, have different capabilities, have different interests, and have a different worldview of how they see what's happening around the world. In that sense, it will remain some difference there, but like you said, it is a question about how the larger power wants to use the kind of power that they have, the kind of influence that they have, right? The case that we saw in Ukraine was the use of ruthless power in order to force through the Russian strategic interest. Again, from a Russian perspective, they might have some strategic concerns out there with the way Russia was behaving, but looking at it, was that the right way to go about it? Now, there are some forums where the rights of small states are taken upon, now, the UN being one of those institutions. Now, even the UN had to have a system whereby there are 5 countries which have special privileges, right? So that it would remain more sustainable and remain more grounded. In that context, it's not that the smaller states do not have a forum, but again, there will be some element of power dominating the scene, but because we expect human beings to be of some moral character as well, we just hope that the states behave similarly as well.
Thank you
Yes,
so much.
next question. Next question.
Good evening, sir. My name is Sharmani and I'm a postgraduate from St. Xavier's College, Kolkata in Political Science. My question is with regard to SARC. As we know that India has brought a lot of countries together in SARC. So, and also these countries are complain about India's elder brother attitude. So I would like to question if Nepal has ever thought of bringing the weak countries together to question India's elderly brother-like attitude. Is it possible that Nepal could bring the weak countries together against India in order to kind of balance out the powers and make the other powers equally powerful in SARC? Thank you.
Okay, I think two aspects to the question, one about SARC, the other about the elderly brother attitude. I think SARC was actually the idea of a small state, in this particular context, Bangladesh, and supported by Nepal and other countries as well. Currently, that's a dead horse. It has been in a coma for a while. I think the BJP manifesto in the last BJP manifesto did not even include SARC, whereas it included other regional forums such as BIMSTEC, BBIN, and others. Now, India is the central country. And when I say this, I say central in more than one ways. Geographically, I think hardly any other SARC member shares a border with another SARC country except India. Now, Nepal shares border with India, but not with others. Same for Bhutan. Similar thing goes for Bangladesh, and so forth. Right? In that context, India is the big power in SARC. It has been the regional big power in the region outside SARC as well. So if India is not very keen to revive SARC, it will be really difficult to revive SARC. Now, regarding bringing in countries which have some issues to counter India, I do not think that is a very sound strategy. Now, we may like or dislike some of the Indian policies or attitude for that matter, but the matter of fact is we have to deal with India. Bangladeshis have to deal with India. The Bhutanese have to deal with India. There is no second way about it. Therefore, the attempt has to be how we can change or affect change in Indian behavior. Now, creating a coalition would only, from my perspective, like to make that matter worse. In the sense that I'm not saying that these countries cannot come together or should not come together, but then I think if the intention is to get back at India, I think that is a wrong place to start. The place to start should be the ways to engage India, but not just on a bilateral basis, but also at a multilateral forum whereby there will be Bangladesh and there will be Bhutan and there will be so forth. Now, one problem with that particular issue is the kind of issues we have with India is not exactly the same kind of issues that Bhutan has with India, right? In that particular context, there is some differences, even though there are some common issues about how India has behaved at certain times, but then those issues are different. And because our interactions with other smaller South Asian states is very limited, it has been very difficult to do so. But then I think one thing that you're right about is I think the smaller nations around India should talk more with each other, not just regarding India, but also regarding other issues so that, if there is, develop a common understanding, which could put a bit more pressure on India.
Yes, next question.
Good evening,
Next question.
sir. Good evening, sir. Yeah. Sir, I am Gaurav. I am currently a student of political science honors from University of Delhi. So my question to you is that over the past few years, we have seen whether it is the territorial dispute between India and Nepal, the Kalapani dispute, or the issue of the Treaty of the India-Nepal Treaty of Peace and Friendship of 1950, there has been a perception that it is an Indian imposition. This is a major perception going on in Nepali politics. Also, we have seen in Nepal shift towards the Border Roads Initiative. It joined the Border Roads Initiative. which was a strategic concern for India as well. Sir, over these years, over these things, even the demonetization where the Nepali Rashtriya Bank had that issue of 500 crores. Sir, we have seen that the Nepali political class, which is controlling the entire politics of Nepal, is non-permeable. There is a class of politicians which is controlling the entire foreign policy of an entire country, Nepal, which even if we look at the scholarships which is awarded by the Indian government towards Nepali citizens, it has basically been on the basis of recommendations made by the government of Nepal. So it is basically that political class which is controlling that entire foreign policy of Nepal. So, sir, can we say that that is the major reason why Nepal has become an apple of discord and is being pulled between the two major economies, that is India and China, and it cannot have its own sovereignty over the past few years?
Thank you, Gaurav, for your question. I think there are a few things to unpack there. First, let me start by saying that, generally there has not been a big power sitting next to a small power where the big power has been a popular force among the people in the smaller powers. Generally, that has been the case, right? Big powers generally don't get very popular in their own neighborhood, right? So in that sense, India is not an exception. I think it is just the part of that trend. Now, again, Nepal-India relations has moved in different phases. Some of the examples that you mentioned, there are some continuing issues, like the 1950 treaty. It is raised from time to time. And some of the Nepalese argument is that it's not equal, has to be abrogated, but then no country actually has taken the initiative to start that process. Even on Nepalese side, no government has taken the initiative to revise that. And there has been a couple of times when India has called Nepal to come up with specific proposals on what they want to revise, and we have not been able to produce. So I think in this particular context, the fault lies in both the places, right? And also, I think regarding the popularity of India, again, it also has its ebbs and flow. Now, I think when Modi came to Nepal the first time, I can't exactly remember, but I think it was in 2014 when he came to Nepal. I think he was popular than any Nepalese leader was at that time. Among friends, we even used to joke that, if Modi ran for prime minister in Nepal, he would have won handily, But then again, within a year, when there was the economic blockade after 2015 earthquake, the whole discourse around India changed. But then again, after a while, we were back on normal terms dealing. Then there came the territorial issues. So this cycle of differences with India, Nepal relations has been a regular feature. Sometimes it goes a little bit higher, the wave is a bit higher. In other cases, it is more constant, but there has been an undercurrent of that in almost all the times, just that the length of the wave sometimes differ, right? So that being said, okay, I think the second part of the question, the elite controlling and being probably the reason, I think that may not be entirely correct, in the sense that I think the Nepalese foreign policy, especially concerning India, is at different levels. For example, Nepal's relations with India would look very different if you ask to the people who live along the border, who oftentimes work on the other side, come back home at night, marry on the other side, and then go to the other side to live. I think that's a very different perspective. Then there is a very strong business interest groups here, a lot of whom are of Indian origin, even though they are Nepalese, right? There is another clique. So if you ask their vision of what India is, probably you'll get a very different idea of Nepal-India relations from their perspective. Then of course you're right that there is a certain elite class which often tends to dominate the policy discussions, especially in the media landscape. Right? There is a certain class, and which is also the class which takes the benefit of some of the, for example, like you mentioned, the scholarship. Most of the time, it just revolves around the people of those elites. That's true in that sense. But then I think Nepal-India relations is much more decentralized, for a lack of a better word, than that. But in saying that, they certainly have an influence. The political class certainly has an influence, but I think they are just one part of the large stakeholder that we have.
Yes, next question. Come on, be quick.
Hello,
Yes, go on.
am I audible? Am I audible, sir?
Yes, yes.
Sir, hi, I'm Mr. Farooq. Sir, my question is, you already mentioned that America's involvement in Nepal. Did America's involvement in Nepal change the status quo of India-Nepal relations as China involvement in Nepal did?
Okay, I think, thank you for the question, Nusrat. I think very important question. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I think the US engagement has affected only one aspect of Nepal-India relations. I think if we have to dig a little bit back in history, for most of the Cold War, when India-US relations was not that great as well, even during those times, the US seems to have largely deferred the responsibility of managing the regional affairs to India, even during that time when India-US relations were not that great. Now that, you know, in the last one and a half decade, India-US relations has improved a lot, I think there is more convergence in terms of interest between India and US, primarily when it comes to the Chinese influence in the region and in globally as well, right? In that sense, there has not been big changes in Nepal-India relations because of the US, but at the same time, India has found a partner who is willing to counter the increasing Indian influence in Nepal. However, I think India is also mindful of the fact that Nepal is its own backyard and it does not want any third country to have much influence in Nepal. For the same reason, it does not want the influence of third countries in Bhutan, or it would want to reduce that. So in that sense, the US-India relations has converged to a certain extent, but not fully. And like I said before, and this is just one aspect of Nepal-India relations. Now, when it comes to 1950 treaty, whatever the US engages Nepal or not, it won't be affected. Ognivir, not affected by what we talk with US, right? Or a host of other issues, they won't be affected by our engagement with the US.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, next question. Come on.
Yes, sir, I'm Riya Sharma and I'm pursuing my master's in political science, as I said in the beginning. So recently I was reading an article about Russian invasion on Ukraine. And sir, there was a sentence that some states as buffer states are best. So sir, I deciphered the sentence in two ways. So one is that yes, buffer states have a natural deterrence, as in if relationship with one big power is not in tandem, then it may drift to the other one. But sir, at the same time, if the buffer state does not maintain the right balance, it may lead to a Ukraine type situation, because even the news about Ukraine's inclusion in NATO was in news for a very long time. So sir, I just want you to discuss about it.
Okay, regarding the first part, buffer states may be good, may not be good, depending on which perspective you are talking about. Probably if you are talking from Indian perspective, Nepal is a buffer state, may be the good policy. If you're talking from Nepal's perspective, that may not be the case. We may not want to be seen as a buffer state, and independent states on its own, probably that's how we'd like to be seen and would like to be behaved as such, right? So in that sense, which perspective are you taking? That is important. But I think another point that you mentioned about things, I think what is clearly important, especially for smaller states around the world, for their own good, is to show some strategic empathy towards the interest of larger states. That is not to say that they have to be under or do whatever the larger states wants them to do, but then it is also for their own sake. I'm saying this not for the sake of the larger power, but for the sake of their own survival. it would be good for small states to show some concern and address the legitimate interests, security interests, or otherwise of larger states. Now, in context of Ukraine, in this particular case, when Ukraine wanted to join NATO as an independent country, it had every right to do so if it wanted to join. But if Ukraine had joined NATO, that would have brought NATO forces just next to the Russian border in one more spot. And that was a red line that Russia was not willing to take. Now, it is not to say Ukraine should not have wanted to join NATO, but then it should also consider what its neighbors' legitimate interests, security interests are, and balance between those two. And that's what basically diplomacy is about, because Ukraine cannot choose to be in any other geographic location. It's there, and that's its reality that it has to live with. It also cannot whisk away Russia or its influence in the region, and it has to manage that as well. So in that particular context, Ukraine had a choice whether it wanted to join NATO or be concerned, be more empathetic to Russian concerns. And in either of the decisions, it would have to face some consequences, right? With its decision to go ahead and say it would want to join NATO, it faced a certain consequence, and that is Russian invasion. If it had decided not to do so, the consequences would have been inability to construct an independent foreign policy, right? So the question for smaller states is, where do you find that balance between maintaining autonomy, maintaining your sovereignty, ensuring your survival, but at the same time, creating a space where you can have more autonomous foreign policy?